We all know our video game history, right? Atari botched the once successful 2600 so badly it took the industry down with it, and then Nintendo swooped in and took over, saving the industry once and for all. You know that story, right? Well, it's wrong. Sorry, but it is. What I just described was the North American version of events, so perhaps the title of the video isn't entirely true because it's not wrong in America. But the internet has adopted it as video game history all on its own, and now it's become the general belief that it was universal. After some recent discussions I've seen online about this kind of thing, which revealed that every country seems to have its own wildly different story to tell, I decided to set the record straight. However, I can't speak for South Asia and its land cafes, or Eastern Europe and its rampant piracy, but I can talk for Britain's history, especially as all the gamers I've spoken to have told the stories time and time again. Admittedly, I didn't live through a lot of this as I was born in the tail end of the 80s, but I've heard the stories enough and seen some of the aftermath of this history play out. So, here are 6 reasons why the internet's version of video game history isn't the full story. 6 reasons why Britain's history doesn't resemble the generally accepted history of video games at all. The video game crash of 1983 is treated as a major event that rocked the world of video games. The Atari 2600 was on top of the world in the early 80s, until the lack of quality control and a market flooded with clones and licensed cash-ins led to a lack of consumer confidence. The market slowed dramatically in 1983 and things looked bleak. And after the commercial failure of the dire E.T. tie-in game, Atari ended up gathering up thousands of unsold cartridges and buried them in the New Mexico desert in a desperate attempt to dispose of them. Unless you were in the UK, in which case you never noticed. The Atari 2600 was popular and was even advertised with popular comedians Morecambe and Wise, and it certainly wasn't strange to see it around, but it wasn't the all-encompassing focus it was in the US. It's not even easy to find out what consumer attitudes to E.T. and the console port of Pac-Man were over here, because while all that was a major event in the US, it barely warrants a mention when talking about the UK market. We all know the next chapter of the story. Nintendo, after successfully launching the Famicom in their home country of Japan, wanted to bring it to the US. However, the video game crash meant they had to be sneaky about it. They changed the name, making it clear it wasn't a family computer, but instead an entertainment system, and marketed it in a way that rarely mentioned video games. Instead, they marketed it as a fancy electronic toy, even developing a peripheral named Rob, and a couple of games for him to be used as a Trojan horse in a trick to get people playing video games again. Rob was kind of rubbish, of course, but the ploy paid off and Nintendo dominated the market for the next decade, while Rob was discontinued and only resurrected to be a playable character in Smash Bros. And Mario Kart 2 decades later. Again, that's the narrative in North America, but not so much in Britain. Over here, the NES was much less of an obvious success story. In fact, it was initially kind of a failure. Nintendo attempted to replicate their American success here in the UK, but they didn't have an office anywhere in Europe to facilitate this. Instead, they partnered with Mattel off of the Barbie and the Hot Wheels to market as an electronic toy to shops around the country. But Mattel clearly weren't sure what to do with this strange electronic box and marketed it poorly to retailers. So poorly, in fact, that at one point only Boots was stocking it. For the Americans, imagine walking into CVS and walking out with a PS5. That's the absurdity of that retailer choice. There was also a point where Argos was selling the NES itself, but no actual games for it, so that's also a great start. These missteps didn't last, of course, and Nintendo did see some growth in the late 80s and early 90s, and when the SNES launched in the UK, its sales were a little more comfortable, not least because its marketing over here was helped by the presence of popular comedian Rick Mayall. It should also be noted as well that the SNES launch here was in 1992, 2 years after its initial Japanese launch, a pattern that would continue for some time in the UK. Nintendo releases were either intensely delayed or in many cases just never happened at all. That's right. We never got Final Fantasy VI until 2001. That happened a lot. And yeah, we pronounce it NES and SNES, not NES and SNES. Deal with it. But despite Nintendo's growth, they still weren't the dominant force here. There were other contenders. So as we all know, Sega in all of this were the perpetual plucky runner-up. The Master System was dwarfed by the NES, and while the Genesis put up a solid fight, despite its marketing it couldn't quite manage what Nintendo did. Unless of course you lived in Europe. Nintendo were flailing here in the UK, leaving an obvious vacuum. While Nintendo struggled to get the NES into retailers to begin with, Sega hit the ground running, selling the Master System prominently in Woolworths and Toys R Us, exactly the kind of places where you'd expect to see a video game system and a huge rack of games. In fact, Woolworths was so effective a retail location for a video game system, the only things I ever remember buying with my pocket money there in the 90s were video games and pick and mix. As a result, this was the first major console to really gain a foothold here and essentially began the growth of the console market. This gave Sega immediate brand recognition that Nintendo had to work much harder for, especially as their name was initially buried under Mattel's. You can see this in old games listings where Sega games vastly outnumbered Nintendo titles. This led to the fourth generation being a little easier for Sega and harder for Nintendo. The SNES had certainly caught up, but the competition between it and the Mega Drive was much tighter. And yes, we called it the Mega Drive, not the Genesis. In fact, most of the world did except America, so we had the correct name. Deal with it. I certainly remember seeing a lot more Sega adverts in the magazines I read as a kid than Nintendo ones, so there clearly was a discrepancy there, and at a time when this is where most people would have gotten their information about games from, that was hugely important. A big part of this success was down to how Sega arranged their distribution. While Nintendo tried to replicate their North American success as a toy, Sega took a different route, partnering with a company called Mastertronic, whose expertise lay in software distribution. It was such a successful partnership that eventually all of Mastertronic's most successful endeavours were in Sega distribution, so much so that that company now exists as Sega Europe. But why was a software distribution company partnership so much more effective than one with a toy company? In order to understand this, we need to have a better look at Mastertronic. A subsidiary of the Virgin Group since 1983, the company would distribute computer software all over the UK, including getting cheap games into newsagents, placing games and software front and centre of British life. Their focus drastically shifted after their success with Sega, but prior to that, there was somewhere else they were releasing games. Because, yes, we've talked a lot about consoles, but you might notice I've been very cagey about saying that Sega dominated the overall games market. Well, that's because the market had another important factor that tends to get overlooked today in the console war discussion. Remember those old listings I showed you where Sega outmatched Nintendo on sheer numbers? Let's extend those listings a little more, shall we? Yes, well, that's interesting. You see, we collectively decided the nation was a PC master race, albeit one dominated by microcomputers, not IBM PCs. The ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 were hugely popular systems in the UK during the 80s, with most of the focus of the games market around these machines. Children of the time would argue over these computers like kids of the early 90s would argue over the SNES and Mega Drive, and grown adults with the maturity of kids argue over the PS5 and Xbox Series X today. Games magazines of the time put these systems front and centre, and would occasionally hand over about 6 or 7 pages exclusively to Sega and Nintendo together. TV coverage of the market focused on these computers, and anywhere you could buy games would be stacked with more cassettes for these machines than they would be for cartridges for the Master System or the NES. This continued into the 90s, where the Atari ST and the Amiga took dominance, with IBM PC sneaking in too. The consoles were an amusing sideshow to these PCs, where the games really were. But why did they dominate so much? In the late 70s and early 80s, it was becoming clear that computers were the future. Early computing was vast and unwieldy, but as computers shrunk and became viable commercial products that had the potential to change our entire infrastructure and ways of working, some national governments recognised the potential. One of those governments was the British government. And so the BBC, our state broadcaster, began to heavily push programmes about computing and coding. And to encourage coding in the population even further, the BBC partnered with Acorn Computers to produce its own microcomputer, literally called the BBC Micro. While not necessarily the most popular commercial machine, it did find itself in schools of the 1980s. And when every school kid in Britain finds themselves in front of a computer in their classes, what happens? Yeah, that's right, they dick around on games. And when they do that and get interested in the medium and TV shows tell them all about how to code their own games and software, it's only a matter of time before those kids want to try it out. And so other computers find their way into British homes en masse, and boom, an entire generation of children hooked on playing and making their own video games happens. And this hobby of making games in bedrooms led to aspiring developers selling those games to each other, which led to growing demand for other people to play those games, which led to distribution companies popping up to sell these homemade games across the country. And those bedroom coders soon became big name developers. And that, for the best part of a decade, became our video game industry. This homemade market was thriving so much it didn't matter how badly Atari screwed up. This homemade market is what Sega saw as its way into Britain, allowing it to gain an early foothold and largely creating the beginnings of our console market. And this homemade market's effects can still be felt in the industry today. Quick, name me a British video game company. Rare? Started out as Ultimate Play the Game as the Stamper Brothers coded games in their bedroom. Some of their early Spectrum games can in fact be found in the Rare Replay compilation. Codemasters? Two brothers coding games for the Commodore who initially saw success publishing through Mastertronic before becoming the biggest producer of racing games in the UK. Media Molecule? One of its co-founders actually started out coding for the Commodore before joining Bullfrog, itself a company that formed out of Commodore software development. Sumo Digital? Formed out of the ashes of Amiga favourite Gremlin. Frontier Developments? Well, one of their most notable successes in the 2010s, Elite Dangerous, was a heavily updated version of a title its founder made for the BBC Micro back in the 80s. And of course, let's not forget this little company called DMA Design, who were started by a quartet of nerdy Scottish classmates coding games for the Amiga, gaining massive success with Lemmings, which then snowballed into them changing their name and eventually creating the biggest entertainment product ever made, Grand Theft Auto 5. So yeah, you can kind of say that our little early indie market kind of left a big impact. Of course, the UK would eventually align with the US in the late 90s with a little-known machine called the PlayStation? I've never heard of it. But it wasn't an immediate 1-1 alignment, not least because the promotion of the system in the UK was vastly different to how it was in the US. While the US will get nostalgic for a shouty man in a Crash Bandicoot outfit, it should be noted that we basically never saw those ads, or if we did, they were rare. I certainly only remember seeing them on the internet in the last decade or so, and certainly not at the time. Instead, the late 1990s was a time of great cultural importance for the UK as the Cool Britannia movement took hold. The raves and Manchester of the early 90s led into Britpop, with Blur and Oasis playing out of public rivalry. The Spice Girls arrived in 1996 and took the entire world by storm with girl power as their slogan. And the UK film industry was going through a renaissance, knocking out a ton of excellent gritty dramas that saw huge success, with the likes of The Full Monty and Trainspotting leading the charge. Sony decided not to give us shouty Crash Man and instead hired the director of Aphex Twin's music videos to give us a weird alien girl, and there was a separate advert that decided to emulate the directorial style of our movies by doing this.
And though in achieving these things,
I have set morality aside,
I have no regrets.
For though I've led a double life, at least I can say I've lived.
And conquered worlds.
Arguably, one of the most important games for the PlayStation in the UK was Wipeout, as its entire soundtrack was ripped from our illegal raves and shoved into a game. And in turn, the game was shoved into our nightclubs, so ravers trashed out of their minds on ecstasy could fumble with anti-grav machines as the Chemical Brothers pumped into their ears. Because back then, Sony UK wanted it to feel as British as possible, despite it being a machine developed in Japan, and still missing a few games that NTSC regions happily played without issues. I'm looking at you, Parasite Eve. How about a release of that, Square Enix? As for the rest of our video game history, yeah, it basically just looks like the US from the PS2 onwards. So for the rest, feel free to consult, all the stuff you already know. But until that moment, we had a very distinct video game market dominated by microcomputers, a homegrown market of bedroom coders, and a desperately flailing Nintendo trying to catch up. A very different time to what the internet will tell you is the history of the industry. But thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this brief look at the unique aspects of British video game history that you might not have known about. If you enjoyed this, why not give the video a like and subscribe for more like this in the future. You might also be interested in these videos on display here. I'd also like to give a big thank you to my patrons whose names are on screen right now. You can join them in their support in the link down below, if you can afford to, of course. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again very soon.